Hi. Thank you all so much for coming. So let us begin with our first slide. There we are. Now, the first question is, what's with the cartoon? This is actually a cover from the Chicago Reader from a 2010 article they did on the parking meter sale and the privatization of Chicago assets. And the person on the left, believe it or not, I think is the artist representation of Richard M. Daley. The guy on the right is a gentleman by the name of John Schmidt. He's still practicing, I think. He's an attorney at the Mayor Brown law firm. And he worked with the city on a whole bunch of their privatization deals. Although, as he said in the article, not the parking meters, which I think got him in a little bit of trouble, actually. And, you know, they're going through their sort of Who Framed Roger Rabbit universe of happy city assets all waiting to be leased. So this lecture covers the period mostly during the 6 terms of Richard M. Daley as mayor. By the way, just reflect, the guy was mayor for 6 terms in a row, which is pretty amazing. As well as the 2 terms of Rahm Emanuel, although there are still things about it that go on till today. And I would like to point out that this issue, this lecture topic, will outlive us as well as our great-great-great-grandchildren, because the last lease for one of these things expires in the year 2105. So enjoy. But in addition to that, though, this is actually something of a perennial topic, and it's the topic of what things that a city does, that a government does, are really governmental, and which of those things should be done by the private sector. And one of the things that I will hopefully convey is that the answer is it really depends. You know, who can do it better or who can do it cheaper. You will often hear, for example, you know, people will run for office and they say, I'm going to run government like a business. And, you know, and the thing is, you know, a government actually isn't a business. They serve different functions. And the thing is that people will often say, and you'll hear a couple times in this lecture, that people will act as if something is naturally or logically a city function or not. And really, whether it is depends on the time you're living in. And just like one example, look at the CTA. The CTA, you've all used to as controlling the L and the bus service, but the fact is the CTA didn't exist until 1947. And it didn't actually take charge of the buses till 1952. Before then, for about a century, all of the public transportation was run by private companies. Another example, and I don't think Charles Okasik is here tonight. So if you see, Charles did a lecture a couple weeks ago on the freight tunnels. And if you check that out on YouTube, you know, he talked about how when the city wanted the freight tunnels dug, they bid out the franchise, the exclusive franchise for digging the freight tunnel. So it was a public service that they put out to the highest bidder to do. And so what you'll see is that really this stuff, it's a question of facts and circumstance. So first, the question is, what are public-private partnerships? Now, I apologize. I pulled this up off the internet. This was the least propaganda-like slide I could find that would explain this stuff. But basically, and people will often refer to these things, again, as P3 projects. Basically, anytime you have a private entity coming in and they are designing, building, operating, or maintaining a project, that's a public-private partnership. So, for example, when your car is illegally parked and it is towed, usually the city will hire a private company to come in and tow it and take it to that area down below Wacker that you can never find. And that's a public-private partnership. When the city builds a new building, the construction contract's a public-private partnership, and so is a contract to hire a janitorial service to clean it. All of those things fit into that category. Now, in the United States, the most common things that we have are things like toll roads, bridges. Actually, a lot of ports in this country are also operated by private companies. But it's not nearly as extensive as it is in Europe. In Europe, it's a very common system of finance. In the US, most of the time when you have a project that a government wants to do and they want to get private financing, instead of doing this thing where they lease it out and they get money to build it, they will issue their own set of bonds. And that's a lot of what I do for a living. The US bond market is and has been for a while about $4 trillion overall, which it sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to like the corporate securities market, it's really not all that much. But most other countries, although they can do it, it's very rare that they do. To the extent that other governments allow their local state and local entities to issue stuff, they usually do it through a central bank, or there's a specific government agency that we do it. But this country, we are batshit crazy, and we let local governments go into the market on their own with their own debt and sell it to the public. It's kind of a crazy business. The other thing you'll note over here, my favorite understatement, typically long-term, difficult to get out of. You might want to remember that for the future. Now, to answer one question, which is, why are they so long-term? The answer is that when you have a lease and it goes out for a very long time, for tax and accounting purposes, it becomes an ownership interest. So if you were the entity that's taking the lease, you can then take your lease payments and you can get depreciation for them. So that's one of the reasons why the assets have to be leased out that long. So first, let's go to the very beginning of privatization, which is when Richard M. Daley, I should say, takes office as mayor in 1989. At that time, a lot more services than today were operated directly by city employees. And the reason for that was basically patronage. It was a leftover of the political machine that became famous under his father, Richard J. Daley. Essentially, everybody who got hired by the city was really hired to do two jobs. One was their actual city job, and the other was to perform political services out in the wards where they lived in favor of the incoming administration, the incumbent administration. Now, there were a number of court orders, which are known as the Shachtman decrees, which happened in the 70s and the early 1980s. And by the way, if we ever do something about unsung heroes of Chicago, Michael Shachtman, who is still alive and is still practicing law at the firm of Miller Shachtman, should be one of those people, because he's the one who sued the city and got them to essentially end political hiring. However, the city jobs still are a pretty useful political tool. You can essentially reward people who have done a good job for the political organization. They can be used to curry favor with businesses. It's a way of, as some aldermen have recently been convicted for, getting political contributions. And so it's still sort of stuck around. But what Daley realized is that there are a lot of ways for the city to do things a lot more efficiently by privatizing. For example, one of the first things he did was he privatized a lot of the towing services, and he financed those on an incentive basis. All the towing companies got paid per car. And so a lot of abandoned cars got pulled away from the city streets very quickly. Another thing that happened, and again, technology plays a part in this too, because in the early 1990s, parking garages were basically run by city employees, and they were done on a cash basis. And the city employees kind of felt somewhat entitled, and so cash receipts were not great. And by putting this in the hands of a private entity that you had contractual accountability with, you could boost collections at your parking garages. Now, just so you understand that this sort of very simple level of privatization is great and there's no harm, in fact there is, and that leads us to our next thing, which is actually, not me cutting the power. But let's see if I can do this while actually talking. Here we go. And so the next thing is this, which is the hired truck scandal. Oh, and the computer. All right, got it. Oh, awesome. Thank you very much.
Stephanie.
Yeah. Woo. You could probably play a drinking game by how many times I'm going to do that during the evening. With the hired truck scandal, this started in 1999. And basically, it was uncovered that a particular firm called Marina Cartage, which was very closely related to the Daly family, had an inordinate amount of city trucking business. And so what happened was the mayor moved where trucking services were being contracted from the fleet department, which they sort of naturally belong to the Office of Budget and Management. And there was also a directive to increase contracts to minority-owned firms. This led to the rise of this guy, and this is Angelo Torres. 3 years before that, Angelo Torres was hired by the city basically to boot cars for not paying their parking tickets. However, he was also a member of what was known as the Hispanic Democratic Organization, which was a very well-run political operation in the 1990s in the city. And he eventually became in charge of the truck program in the Office of Budget and Management. And he essentially created a list of approved firms. So it was no bid. Everybody who was on this list you could hire from, and everyone in the city had to go to this list. So everything was in this guy's hands. And the reason why this was discovered was a reporter for the Sun-Times named Tim Novak was walking on his block one day, and he noticed some city workers on a project, and there was this one guy sitting in a dump truck not doing anything, and for like hours on end. And so being a reporter, he decided to investigate this. And in 2003, 2004, he broke a series of stories on this. What he found was that there were a whole bunch of firms who were being given these contracts to have trucks go out to these sites and do nothing at an hourly rate of $50.17. And the best part of this was a lot of the other city employees who were at these sites were kind of miffed about it. And there's this great quote by someone who said, if anyone's going to sit around and do nothing, it ought to be a city worker. There were two other fun little facts about this that were uncovered. And someone who I did want to shout out who is here, Giovina. Is Giovina here? There she is. Giovina did a lecture a couple weeks ago on the history of the mob in Chicago. This investigation showed that about 10% of the firms were linked to members of the Chicago outfit. And in addition, and this was my favorite fact, is many of these firms happened to buy insurance from none other than the mayor's brother and Cook County Commissioner, John Daly. Oops. This led to a series of indictments. Angelo Torres eventually went to jail essentially for extorting trucking companies to get put on the list. The guy on the right, who was Don Tomczak, who was a water department commissioner, ended up taking over $500,000 in bribes to do the same thing. So both of those folks went to jail. Now, there was an attempt in 2005 to pass an ordinance that would have given the city council approval on private contracts like this. It did not go anywhere, but hang on to that thought, because this will come up again a little bit later. So that gets to our next thing, and this is the first actual privatization of an asset, the Skyway. And see, here we have a very nice view. Fortunately, you're not there with your windows open as you're driving over it. And for those who've done it will know what I mean. This was built and completed in 1958 to connect the Dan Ryan with the Indiana Toll Road. It's about 7.8 miles long. It features the Steel Truss Bridge, which is about a half a mile long, and it crosses the Calumet River and Calumet Harbor. The city had started looking at leasing this thing in 2002 because, amongst other things, it had just never been a real moneymaker. For those of you who do travel to northern Indiana, there's another free set of highways that you can take. So you don't actually have to use the Skyway. And in fact, there was a period of time in the early 1990s when the city almost ended up having a default on the bonds that were used to finance the construction. However, the financial fortunes turned around right around the turn of the century. And in 2000, the amount of traffic had doubled from what it had been 20 years before, and the amount of revenue had actually quadrupled. So it had slowly become a moneymaker. And around this time, worldwide, a number of other entities were starting to privatize toll roads. This was happening in Canada, it was happening in Italy, Portugal, some other places. This privatization was the first time a toll road was privatized in the United States. And this was done in 2004. As part of it, there was actually special legislation that had to get passed at the state level because normally under state law, the state will tax a commercial leasehold. So basically, if you were to lease an asset for commercial purposes, you have to pay a tax on that. And the state passed a special exemption that would allow this to happen. So bids were put out in 2004. The deal was executed at the beginning of 2005. It got leased out for 99 years for the total of $1.82 billion to a consortium led by a firm from Spain called Sintra, and a firm from Australia called Macquarie, and those are both private investment firms. I will add, because this comes up a lot, the way most of these things work is the administration gets the idea to do this, and at the beginning of a calendar year, they will put out bids for it, and they give people like 6 months to respond, and then it's approved, and then right around the time the city's budget is also due, they ask the city council to approve this thing. It gives the impression, because of subsequent events, that what happened was, the city just came up with these things at the last minute because they were short on money. And that's actually not what really happened. They actually put more thought into it than that. But the timing makes it look very bad. The approval process on this, again, because of the nature of city politics, was very short. I mean, the city council got 5 days' notice to consider this thing. Despite that fact, they actually voted unanimously in favor of it. They thought it was a tremendous windfall. At the time, Alderman Ed Burke said this was about as good a deal as when the Dutch purchased Manhattan from the Indians. And overall, if you were to look back on this, it was actually a pretty good deal for the city. Because first of all, the city said, well, this is not a core city function, so that's why we get rid of it. And if you think about it again, that's a very arbitrary thing to say. Because, I mean, if it wasn't a core city function, why'd you build it, right? But it was a good asset to lease because, number one, it wasn't a great moneymaker for the city. Number two, geographically, it was really outside the normal geographic boundaries of the city. And so a lot of city residents didn't use it. So politically, the burden of who the tolls fall on isn't necessarily going to be city residents. And the other thing about it was, and this was the best part of it really, was that as part of the lease, the operation and maintenance costs for the tollway got pushed onto the lessee, which is great. Because while the city certainly does a lot of street repairs, other than DuSable Lakeshore Drive, they don't do highway repairs. And it's a very different category of construction work. With all of this money, the first thing the city did, which was responsible, was they retired all the bonds to build it. They retired a bunch of other city debt. They ended up purchasing an annuity, which was used to help pay city expenses for a couple of years, and they established a budget reserve. The other thing I'll mention also was that there are contractual limitations in it that limits how great the maximum toll rate can be. At the time, it was $2. Right now, it's at $7.80. Arguably, by 2050, it could be as high as $30. We will see. So that was the first one. Now, our second deal, which was sort of spread on by this, is the parking garages. And see, all right, that's two. Everyone take a sip. Okay. So, with the success of this deal, a lot of state and local entities in the area started considering leasing assets. For example, the most successful one was probably the state of Indiana. Indiana leased the Indiana Toll Road for $3.8 billion around this time. This is also when the city first started to think about leasing Midway Airport, which we'll get into a little bit later. At the time, Governor Blagojevich talked about leasing the Illinois Lottery. Nothing came from that, although a lot of the functions of the Illinois Lottery are privatized. They hire a lot of outside firms to do a lot of the functions. And of course, Governor Blagojevich later on in his career attempted to privatize something else, which I think we all know about, and that did not work out so well. Anyway, the Millennium Parking garages at the time were operated by the Chicago Park District. And in 2006, as a first step, the city of Chicago and the Park District went to the state government, and they got that same tax exemption under state law extended to include both the parking garages as well as Midway Airport. So for the bidding process for this, there were a total of 13 bidders. The winner was a consortium led by Morgan Stanley, and they paid approximately $500 million for a 99-year lease. So this is the last one that expires. This one expires in 2105. Once again, it was approved very quickly by the city council by a vote of 37-8. The biggest obstacle to this was actually a concern by Alderman Dorothy Tillman that Morgan Stanley violated the city's ordinance on disclosure of ties to slavery, which is an ordinance that is still in effect. And there was a lot of back and forth about which Morgan Stanley entity is it and how old it was and stuff. Quick historical shout out to Dorothy Tillman. I wish I could not find a good picture of her to put on her. But the great thing about Dorothy Tillman was she was an alderman for 20 years, and every day at city council, she dressed up like she was going to the Kentucky Derby. She had these enormous, colorful, wide brim hats. She kept them on at all times during proceedings. It was wonderful. Again, the overall assessment, was this a good deal? It actually was. Again, this was not a great asset for the city. The revenues from the garages had not been great. The city had struggled to meet the payments on the bonds that were used to finance that part of Millennium Park. Once again, the city had a stock line. Well, the city shouldn't be in the business of leasing of operating parking garages. Again, the city built the parking garages, and I think there may be other parking garages the city still owns. But again, they used the lease proceeds well. They retired the debt. They had about $285 million used for park improvements. I couldn't trace all of it, but like $122 million of it was used to provide 5 new field houses and 50 new parks. And the other interesting thing about this one was, unlike the Skyway lease and unlike even the parking meter lease, they did not put any limits on the parking rates that could be charged. And they did that on the theory that, well, there's only 5 garages here and the city is filled with parking garages. The market should keep these rates reasonable. Well, the thing is, it worked in the sense that the rates everywhere suck. But these don't suck any worse than the other rates do. So there you are. Now, finally, we will get to the main course here, our parking meters. Now, here is the good old-fashioned parking meter. And I will there. Now, in 2008, the city had approximately 36,000 of these. They were all hand-fed by quarters. And if you lived in the city in 2008, and you rented an apartment, you basically always had at least 2 rolls of quarters. You had 1 roll for this, and then you had another roll so that you could do your laundry. So, okay. Now, the rates had not been raised in over 20 years at this time, primarily because of the backlash. And in fact, the revenue from these in 2008 was only $22 million. And as you'll see as we get into this, it's something that should have been done. The city should have been getting more revenue from it. In 2008, of course, we had the recession that started from the mortgage-caused financial crisis. And so the city really was facing a budgetary hole, although, again, the parking meter lease process started several months before that, right at the beginning of 2008. But ultimately, the budget that was passed in that year ended up with 650 employees getting fired. They slowed down police hiring to a bare minimum. And they actually built into this a $150 million line item that was going to be paid from this lease. The request for proposals on this, again, went out in February. They got 10 bidders on it, and ultimately they got a winning bid of $1.15 billion for a 75-year lease for a partnership that was headed by Morgan Stanley and an entity called LAZ Partners. And they ended up forming, oh no, if you really want someone to boo, you should really boo the entity they formed, which is Chicago Parking Meters LLC, because they're so, yeah, very perfect. All right, now, and once again, what part of what makes this look bad was after a 9-month bidding process, this was approved by the city council in 3 days. The mayor called a special meeting of the city finance committee and then of the city council to just try to ram it through. And unlike some of these other deals, because it involved parking rates, aldermen were very, very critical. The best quote of this was from Walter Burnett, who's still an alderman, who said the proposal sounded like a Cialis ad with the side effects seeming worse than the actual cure. Alderman Ocasio went through a stunt of taking a piggy bank filled with $28 in quarters and emptying it on his desk. And I envision what happened there was he probably went to some poor college intern in his office and said, go out, buy a piggy bank, buy a bunch of quarters, and fill this up for me. And despite this, though, it got approved 40-5. Interestingly enough, though, amongst the no votes, 2 of them were Tony Preckwinkle and Scott Wagaspak, who has been chairman of the city finance committee subsequently. Oh my God! And here's Morocco, as if I haven't dropped the power converter enough. All right, let's switch that over. Okay, now the biggest problem with this thing was really the implementation. And part of this is how convoluted the process is. By the way, my favorite thing about this cartoon is the artist felt as if the cartoon of Stephen Hawking had to be labeled Stephen Hawking. Because apparently people knew Stephen Hawking was a physicist, but didn't know he was in a wheelchair. I don't know. Anyway. Part of the implementation problem with this is that the lessee, Chicago Parking Meters LLC, raised rates immediately with the old equipment still in place and all the old street signs in place. And at some places, the rates were literally quadrupled. In addition to which rates went into the evenings for the first time, which they had never done before. You had to pay on Sundays, which you never had to do before. And the maximum rate went up to $3.50 per hour at that time, which was actually not the highest in the country. It was actually only the 5th highest. So hey. And at the point, it could be increased by 75 cents a year up to $6.50 in 2013, and then increased by the rate of inflation. Now, part of the problems you had were because the rate was much higher, and again, remember, this does not hold a lot of quarters. So if you're going to pay for an hour after you've had 1 or 2 people there, the meter gets filled up with quarters and becomes inoperable, which means that space cannot be used. And if it was 2009 and you did that and you put in your money and you got halfway through and you're like, I don't know what else to do, and you left, you got a ticket. Didn't matter. If the city failed to change the signs and you didn't know you couldn't park there for free on Sundays or after 6 p.m., you got a ticket, and it didn't really matter. And the city kept enforcing those things because that was part of their obligations under the lease. And unfortunately, it didn't really get any better once we put in the new machines because, among other things, at the time, you could not pay on your phone and have an electronic record that somebody could just scan. When you put your money in, you got a receipt, and you took the receipt, you walked over to your car, you put it inside on your dashboard. Problem is, these things ran out of paper very fast. And if you put your money in and you didn't get a receipt and you walked away mad, you still got a ticket. It didn't matter. In addition, the machines were sort of difficult to use. Signs didn't get changed very quickly. There was actually one bright spot to this, which was that although parking got way more expensive, we actually, I think, ended up getting more parking in the city. And the reason for that is that when you had meters, the amount of parking on the street was based on the number of meters you could fit. And each meter had a certain amount of space allocated to it. Now, the amount of cars that can fit on the street is however many cars you can fit on the street. So my guess is probably every block you can fit at least one or two more cars. So, an unintended benefit. The money was, at the time, was proposed to be put into various reserve and rainy day funds. In fact, by 2012, very little of the money was left. It was used to fill holes in both the 2010 and the 2011 budgets. And so most of that $1.15 billion was gone. Now, the next part of this, though, is that there was a lot of bickering and modifications that happened. So let's go back to our next slide. So here we have Rahm Emanuel. And this was a nice reminder to me of how the cartoons of Rahm have a certain satanic quality to them, I think. But when he got in office, he got presented with a bill by Chicago Parking Meters LLC for about $50 million. And the reason for that was that any time under the lease, the maximum number of spaces weren't available, the city was supposed to make up the difference. So if streets had to be closed for whatever reason, you were having a summer street fair, city paid. If you had construction on that street and people couldn't park there, city had to pay. They also, in a wonderful, wonderful feat of civilian protest, what apparently a lot of people did was they took advantage of a loophole in the lease where disabled people did not have to pay, and people would manufacture fake handicap stickers and they'd put them on their cars. And by the way, you cannot do that anymore. The state passed a statute in like 2013, I think, which basically said unless your disability prevents you from physically going out and getting the parking pass, you still have to pay even if you have a handicap sticker. So, God forbid we should do handicapped people a favor. Now, the Emanuel administration worked out a settlement. They got the overall amount that they had to pay reduced to about $8.9 million. They brought back free parking on Sundays. Although I will say, interestingly enough, there are a number of places here where the retailers have actually asked for the Sunday parking to come back. And the reason for that apparently is they want to increase turnover there in certain retail districts. And the other thing was, you'll really enjoy this. This, for the first time, provided for the ability to pay for your parking by phone for the payment of a fee of 35 cents for every transaction. So yes, you are paying Chicago Parking Meters LLC for the privilege of paying Chicago Parking Meters LLC for your parking. In addition to which, evening hours in certain areas got extended even further, so as part of that. Now, subsequent to this, there has been even more bickering that has gone on through the Lightfoot and even the Johnson administrations. The company filed a claim against the Lightfoot administration, and it was hard to figure out exactly how they did this, but there's a provision in the lease that has to do with the number of spots that are reserved by the city. And I guess the city kind of played fast and loose with that during the pandemic, so there's been a claim as to how much money they owe there. Also, one of the other wonderful benefits of having the NASCAR race here in Chicago was all those streets that got closed for the NASCAR race, we now owe Chicago Parking Meters LLC for that. So, yeah, enjoy that. So that is, again, that's something that still has not been settled. And finally, because again, I am a lawyer, I had to do this. In April 2023, there was a federal case in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals called Utrecht versus Chicago Parking Meters, where the plaintiffs basically tried to rule or get a ruling that this whole thing was illegal because it violated the antitrust laws, because you couldn't have a private entity with a monopoly on parking. And basically what the court ruled was that, look, there's a rule under the anti-monopoly provision under the Sherman Antitrust Act in federal statutes that says that there's an exemption for state and local government things, and if the state wants to contract that out, that's okay. And they then sort of strongly applied, no matter how bad a decision you think that is. Overall assessment of this, was it a bad deal? Bad deal is not the right choice of words. It represents a couple of bad choices, because bad deal implies that the city was somehow not competent, and that's not true at all. They structured the best deal they could get. The problem is really two things, well, three. The first is that they picked an asset that was a moneymaker for the city and that they could have used to generate more revenues for themselves and even to create a bond issuance that would have paid for this new equipment that they could have done themselves, and they could have, for example, established their own reserve fund, but they chose not to. They tried to avoid the political headache of doing that by contracting it out. The second thing was that the implementation of this was just god-awful, and it was actually very uncharacteristic of the Daley administration to try and do that. The other part of it is that unlike, for example, the Skyway lease, you will notice that when people are out there monitoring the enforcement of all of the parking, who do those people work for? They work for the city. So the city pays their salaries, they have to make pension payments for those folks. So that's an expense that is ongoing and for which the city's no longer getting anything. And that's going to continue, again, for 75 years. The other part of this is when you read between the lines in the news stories of the time, again, while this is not something that the city came up with at the last minute to avoid like a one-year budget hole, I think what was pretty clear was they looked at the situation and they realized we're going into a recession. This thing's going to last 2 or 3 years. Our choices are either austerity and cut a lot of programs and make a lot of people really unhappy, raise taxes in the middle of a recession, which may not even generate the revenue and make a lot of people unhappy, or we can use this to kind of get us through, and that was the option they chose. So it was, perhaps the best of a bad bunch, but again, you could argue that had they maybe spent a little more time on it, they probably could have ended up taking the asset, raising the rates themselves, and tried to get through the problem that way. Now that gets us to our next privatization. This is the one that didn't happen, which is Midway Airport. Now, this is actually the first page of the children's coloring book, which you can get off of the flychicago.com website. And I put this on here because, in days like today, when there have been air crashes and people are all concerned about airport safety and what's going to happen with cuts to the FAA and everything else, it is comforting to know that when you go to the airport, there will be a donkey and a llama there to make you feel better about air travel. So, as I said again, the city has been considering privatizing Midway since about 2006. A lot of airports around the world are privatized. There's only one in the US where that's been done. That's Stewart International Airport, which is in upstate New York. The city filed an application to do this in 2006. The FAA rules required that they get approval of 65% of all of the airlines at the airport to do that. And after some negotiation, they got the consent of all the airlines in 2007. Basically, they got an agreement from the airlines that they would freeze all of the rates they would get charged for the first 6 years of any lease. And the other thing is Midway's finances made it a really good asset for the city to lease, because all of the money that is generated there really comes from the airlines. The airlines pay for fees to use terminals and gates. They pay for landing rights. And all of those things come into the city, and the city has all of these things in a bond indenture. An indenture is basically just a big document that covers the terms under which you can issue bonds. And all of those things, essentially, while they get passed through to people who travel through Midway by air, number one, it isn't necessarily city residents. It could be people traveling through or traveling here for tourism or business or whatever. But secondly, when you see that on your ticket, you're not mad at the city, you're mad at the airline. So politically, there's not liability there. So the other thing that's important about that is both FAA rules and the terms of the bond indenture say that you cannot take money that the airport generates and use it for anything other than the airport, which was very smart because you don't want rates to be raised there inordinately high just to use the thing as a cash cow. But if the city wanted to ever get any kind of extra economic benefit out of it, the only way to do it was to privatize it. So, and that, one more sip, hang on. And so the idea would be that the city would do that, and then they would use, part of that to pay off the total amount of bonds. And I think at the time there were about 1.3 billion worth of bonds. And then the rest of it the city could use for a number of purposes. So in 2008, they put out a number of bids. They got a total of 5 bidders. They got a winning bid, which was a consortium headed by both Citigroup and the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. And the winning bid was actually $2.5 billion. And I found a quote, and by the way, this was 30 times the annual cash flow at Midway at the time. And an economist who did privatizations was quoted as saying, "I can imagine only 2 kinds of businesses that would get a better payment than that. One is the red light district, the other is drugs." So it was, considered a very good deal. This sailed through city council. It got approved 49-0. And aldermen everybody kind of had their hand out, like, okay, I'm ready for my new library for my district now. There were plans to do a whole bunch of things. They were going to use this to pay for a number of new CTA stations, all kinds of stuff. Unfortunately, this got killed by the very same 2008 financial crisis that ended up making all of the money from the parking meter lease go away. And the winning bidder couldn't get financing to do this, so they had to pull out. The only silver lining to that was that they did have to forfeit a payment to the city of $126 million, which, again, because of the financial crisis, got immediately sucked up. Now, this got revived by the Emanuel administration in 2011. They tried to do this again. And had this gone through, I actually would have worked on this deal. But there were a number of different requirements. Now, because of the backlash over the parking meters, there were a number of things that were used as limitations. First of all, the lease was limited to 40 years. Secondly, the lease provided that instead of an upfront payment, there would be a sharing of revenues throughout the lifetime of the lease. There was also what was referred to as a traveler's bill of rights. And unfortunately, I didn't have any details as to what would be in that. And then the city also made a pledge that the lease proceeds would not be used for operating expenses, only for infrastructure. So basically, imagine a big neon sign saying, "Not the parking meters lease." Not necessarily coincidentally, with all of these more stringent terms, they couldn't attract any bidders for this thing. Basically, by September 2013, they were down to 2 bidders, and one of them dropped out. And at that point, the Emanuel administration just sort of threw up its hands, and they told the FAA that they were going to withdraw their application. And so that's gone, and I do not expect it to come back anytime soon. The one final thing, though, that has happened, and this is still around in terms of privatization, is this, which is, I'm really sorry that the clarity is so bad, because when I hand out the written quiz later, I was going to make it open book, but apparently we can't do that now. Anyway, there is the Privatization, Transparency, Accountability, and Performance Ordinance. This was done in 2015 by the Emanuel administration, and this establishes procedures and protections for 2 different things. The first is the large-scale privatization of city assets, and then the second is the privatization of city contracts. Ultimately, when you look at this thing, basically, this was an exercise in trying to avoid all of the blame allotment that had been going on since the parking meter lease, with aldermen kind of repeatedly saying, oh, if only we had had enough time to properly consider the parking meter lease that we approved 40 to 5, we would have definitely changed our minds. And it also allowed Mayor Emanuel to say, look, I'm being much more transparent than the mayor because I have this wonderful program. Now, having said that, though, and I'll get into this more later, a lot of critics pointed out at the time that, the way city politics are, if the mayor has control of the city council, it really doesn't matter how many procedures you have. If he wants something to get approved, it's going to get approved. Having said that, though, there are a couple of interesting provisions in here. In terms of long-term leases, it does provide that there'd be an independent advisor to assess both the transaction and also the bid selection process. That independent advisor has to produce a report, and that report has to be provided to the city committee that has a hearing on the transaction, and they have to get it for 23 days. And then the hearing takes place at a minimum 7 days before the city council votes on it. And there also had to be a plain English description of the transaction that got posted publicly at the time they sent out the solicitation for bids. All of which is great. However, there were a couple of limitations on this. The first was that it only applied to transactions with a length of over 20 years and a value of over $400 million. And the other part of it is the city was pretty non-committal about the use of proceeds. They agreed that 10% of the net proceeds would be held onto by the city, but even then, that was only if the lease was for more than 30 years. So there were not a lot of limitations on what the city can do with the money. In terms of the city contracts ordinance, there are some procedural requirements there. It basically said for any city contract to privatize services, you had to have a cost-benefit analysis done, and you also had to have a public hearing. This applied, however, only to contracts for $3 million or more. And there were also a number of exceptions. For example, if there was an emergency, if it was very rare services, if it was for things involving technical or artistic merit, those were excluded. Although I will say those exclusions you will find in almost any public bidding statute anywhere in this country. So that's actually not all that uncommon. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. The first is, if you think about the hired truck scandal, none of that is prevented by this ordinance, right? Secondly, while the city has to approve the transaction at the end, the one thing the city council still doesn't do is exercise any kind of control over the bidding process. So in terms of framing the deal that's set out for bid, that's produced by the mayoral administration on their own. And there's no real say in what goes out to the public. So the city council is basically asked to be a yes or no stamp, and that's it. The third thing to be pointed out with this ordinance is anytime the city council wants to, a simple majority vote will overturn this whole thing. It's not like it's not written in stone. It's not like a constitution. It's just an ordinance. So that's where we are. And I guess if you want to have what have we learned about this? I guess it's three things. The first is that whether or not these things are a good deal or not kind of depends on the asset. There are certain ones where it's perfectly fine. There are certain other ones, the ones where it's a good, steady source of revenue, it doesn't make sense to do that. You ought to just keep that revenue source. Which sort of leads into the second thing is when you do this and you have this big payment, what should you do with it? And I would argue, and I think a lot of other economists would say, the best thing to do with it is probably to pay down your existing debt or your pension obligations. Because whatever you're doing in either that situation or when you've got a good revenue source is you are keeping a maximum amount of money available every year for what you can spend on your operating budget, because all of the debt that you pay down now is debt service you don't have to pay later. The third part of this is sort of the moral of the story is that safeguards and procedural review and bureaucracy are actually really important, because they prevent bad things from happening. I have family members here, and they have heard me say this before, and they can cover their ears now. My definition of bureaucracy is a bad system that prevents even worse things from happening. And no one ever really notices that because you're essentially preventing a negative. It's sort of like the same way people feel about vaccines. It's like, well, I didn't get sick. Well, that's how vaccines work. Again, as we see right now, where people who are doing things like protecting our food supply and making sure airplanes land safely, and that contracts are only awarded to people who don't have a history of past contractual violations and God knows what else. It's important to remember that all of those people who do that are public servants, and they should, you don't have to be thanking them, but you should be grateful that they're there. So I would love to take questions if people have any.